What if I told you that some souls become trapped between worlds, refusing to accept their death and clinging desperately to the physical realm they once knew? Edgar Cayce, America's most documented psychic, discovered through his authenticated readings that certain souls make a terrifying choice after death. Instead of moving forward into the light, they anchor themselves to earthly existence, creating what Cayce called spiritual prisons that can last for decades or even centuries. In his chilling reading 5749-14, delivered while in deep trance at his Virginia Beach office, Cayce encountered a soul that had been trapped for over 80 years, still believing it was alive and desperately trying to communicate with the living world. What this soul revealed about its tormented existence will shake you to your core and completely transform everything you thought you knew about death, the afterlife, and the choices that determine where consciousness goes when the body dies. Before we dive into these disturbing revelations that could change how you view life and death forever, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. The information I'm about to share comes directly from Cayce's documented archives, preserved at the Association for Research and Enlightenment, and it reveals truths about the afterlife that most people are never prepared to hear. Have you ever felt the presence of someone who passed away, experienced unexplained cold spots in certain rooms, or heard voices when no one else was around? What I'm about to reveal might explain those experiences in ways that will both comfort and terrify you. Because according to Edgar Cayce's readings, some of these encounters aren't just memories or imagination. They're actual contact with souls who have made the devastating choice to remain earthbound rather than continue their spiritual journey. Over the next several minutes, I'll expose 3 shocking discoveries from Cayce's documented readings that reveal why certain souls refuse to move on and what happens to consciousness when it becomes trapped between dimensions. First, the specific conditions that create what Cayce called spiritual limbo, and why some souls choose this tormented existence over peaceful transition. Second, the documented case of a soul that communicated through Cayce after being trapped for nearly a century, describing in horrifying detail what it experienced during those decades of spiritual imprisonment. And third, Cayce's dark warning about how these earthbound souls can influence and even possess the living, creating cycles of spiritual bondage that span generations. Edgar Cayce wasn't just any psychic making wild claims about the afterlife. For over 4 decades, from 1901 to 1945, he conducted more than 14,000 documented psychic readings. While in a deep unconscious state, every single session was recorded by professional stenographers, and today these readings are preserved in the archives of the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, Virginia. When Cayce entered his trance state, he accessed what he called the universal consciousness, allowing him to observe the experiences of souls in various stages of their spiritual journey. But nothing prepared his longtime secretary, Gladys Davis, for what she would record during reading 2072-10 in 1943. A desperate family had contacted Cayce about disturbing phenomena in their home following the death of their patriarch 6 months earlier. Doors would slam shut on their own, objects would move across rooms, and family members reported feeling an oppressive presence that seemed to follow them throughout the house. When Cayce investigated this case psychically, what he discovered was far more disturbing than a simple haunting. The soul of the deceased patriarch was indeed present in the house, but not as a peaceful spirit visiting loved ones. According to Cayce's reading, this soul had made a conscious choice to reject the spiritual guides who came to escort him to higher dimensions. Instead of accepting his death and moving forward, he had anchored himself to the physical world through sheer force of will, creating what Cayce described as a self-imposed spiritual prison. Here's what shocked even Cayce himself about this soul's condition. The trapped spirit genuinely believed it was still alive. It could see its family members, but couldn't understand why they wouldn't respond to its attempts at communication. It watched them grieve its death while being unable to comprehend that it was the corpse they had buried. This soul existed in a nightmarish state of confusion, growing increasingly desperate and angry as months passed without acknowledgement from the living world. But wait, there's something even more disturbing that Cayce revealed about why this soul chose to remain earthbound. In reading 2072-10, the spirit communicated through Cayce that it had refused to move on because of overwhelming attachment to material possessions and an obsessive need to control family affairs even after death. This soul couldn't bear the thought of leaving behind the wealth it had accumulated, the business empire it had built, and the family members it felt needed its continued guidance. What makes this case particularly chilling is that Cayce revealed the soul's attachment was actually growing stronger over time rather than weaker. Instead of gradually accepting its death and releasing earthly concerns, this spirit was becoming more entrenched in its delusion, more desperate in its attempts to influence the physical world, and more hostile toward any suggestion that it should move on to higher spiritual dimensions. This brings us to one of Cayce's most frightening discoveries about earthbound souls. In reading 1947-3, he explained that souls who refuse to accept death don't simply fade away or eventually give up. Instead, they develop what he called spiritual parasitism, learning to feed off the life energy of living people to maintain their connection to the physical realm. These trapped souls become increasingly skilled at influencing the thoughts, emotions, and actions of susceptible individuals, creating a form of spiritual bondage that can persist for generations. Let me share with you a documented case that perfectly illustrates this terrifying phenomenon. In 1939, a young woman from Norfolk came to Cayce seeking help for what she described as a complete personality change that had occurred over several months. Previously cheerful and optimistic, she had become morose, angry, and obsessed with accumulating money and material possessions. Her family reported that she seemed like a completely different person, speaking in ways that reminded them of her recently deceased grandfather, a miserly businessman who had been known for his ruthless pursuit of wealth. During reading 1472-12, Cayce revealed that the woman was indeed being influenced by her grandfather's earthbound soul. The old man's spirit had recognized her psychic sensitivity and had begun gradually merging its consciousness with hers, attempting to continue living through her physical body. Cayce explained that this wasn't a case of demonic possession, but rather spiritual manipulation by a soul that refused to accept its death and move on to appropriate spiritual dimensions. What's most disturbing about this case is how gradually and subtly the influence occurred. The grandfather's soul didn't suddenly take control of the woman's body. Instead, it slowly began implanting its thoughts, desires, and obsessions into her consciousness, making her believe these were her own natural inclinations. Over months, her personality shifted to mirror the earthbound soul's characteristics, creating what Cayce called spiritual identity theft. But here's where Cayce's revelations become truly frightening. For anyone seeking to understand the afterlife, according to reading 3744, souls who become earthbound don't just affect one person. They actively seek out multiple living individuals they can influence, particularly family members who share genetic and emotional connections. These trapped spirits create what Cayce termed spiritual networks, using living people as anchors to maintain their connection to the physical world, while spreading their influence across entire bloodlines. Cayce documented cases where earthbound souls influenced multiple generations, passing their obsessions, fears, and unresolved issues to children and grandchildren who had never even met them in life. These spiritual inheritances often manifested as unexplained phobias, compulsive behaviors, or destructive life patterns that seemed to run in families for no apparent reason. The trapped souls were essentially using their descendants as vessels to continue experiencing physical existence, creating cycles of spiritual bondage that could persist for centuries. In reading 5749-8, Cayce revealed something that will completely change how you think about certain mental and emotional disorders. He explained that many cases of severe depression, anxiety, addiction, and even multiple personality disorders are actually the result of earthbound soul influence rather than purely psychological conditions. These trapped spirits, desperate to continue experiencing physical sensations and emotions, attach themselves to living individuals who possess psychic sensitivity or emotional vulnerability. The most chilling aspect of this revelation is that the living person often has no idea they're being influenced by a deceased soul. They experience the trapped spirit's emotions, desires, and memories as if they were their own, creating confusion about their true identity and life purpose. Cayce described this as one of the most insidious forms of spiritual interference, because the victim believes they're dealing with their own psychological issues when they're actually being manipulated by a soul that refuses to move on to appropriate spiritual dimensions. Here's what makes Cayce's warnings about earthbound souls even more terrifying. According to Reading 1362:18, these trapped spirits don't remain static in their spiritual development. Instead, they actually devolve, becoming increasingly desperate, manipulative, and hostile as decades pass without resolution. What begins as simple attachment to earthly concerns gradually transforms into something far more sinister. Cayce described encountering souls that had been earthbound for over 2 centuries, and what he found was shocking. These ancient spirits had developed sophisticated methods of spiritual manipulation, learning to prey upon human weaknesses with calculated precision. They no longer simply clung to material possessions or family members. Instead, they had evolved into what Cayce called spiritual predators, actively hunting for vulnerable individuals they could influence or possess. In Reading 2941-7, Cayce documented his encounter with one such ancient earthbound soul. During a reading for a family experiencing severe paranormal disturbances, this spirit had been trapped since the Civil War era, initially refusing to move on because of obsessive attachment to land it had owned in life. But after 80 years of earthbound existence, this soul had transformed into something barely recognizable as human consciousness. Through Cayce's trance state, this ancient spirit revealed that it had learned to feed off human fear, anger, and despair to maintain its connection to the physical world. It actively sought out households where there was emotional turmoil, family dysfunction, or psychological instability, because these conditions provided the negative energy it needed to sustain itself. Most disturbingly, it had developed the ability to amplify existing problems within families, turning minor disagreements into explosive conflicts that would generate the emotional chaos it craved. But here's where Cayce's revelations become absolutely terrifying for modern families. This ancient soul explained that it wasn't alone. Over the decades, it had encountered hundreds of other earthbound spirits, and they had formed what Cayce described as spiritual networks of trapped consciousness. These entities worked together, sharing information about vulnerable individuals and even coordinating their influence to maximize their impact on the living world. What's most frightening is that these spiritual networks specifically target families with psychic sensitivity, multi-generational trauma, or unresolved emotional issues. They recognize that these conditions make individuals more susceptible to spiritual influence, and they exploit these vulnerabilities with ruthless efficiency. The result is entire family systems that become spiritually compromised, with multiple generations experiencing unexplained mental health issues, relationship problems, and self-destructive behaviors. Cayce revealed in Reading 3976-8 that these earthbound soul networks are particularly active during times of social upheaval, war, or natural disasters. The mass trauma and emotional instability created by such events provides them with abundant opportunities to attach to vulnerable individuals. This explains why certain locations seem perpetually troubled, experiencing cycles of violence, tragedy, or dysfunction that persist across decades or even centuries. The most chilling example Cayce documented occurred during reading 4167 in 1944, when he investigated a house in Virginia that had been the site of multiple family tragedies over 60 years. 3 different families had lived there, and each had experienced similar patterns of domestic violence, financial ruin, and premature death. When Cayce psychically examined the property, he discovered it was inhabited by a network of 7 earthbound souls, all victims of violence from different time periods who had refused to move on after their traumatic deaths. These trapped spirits had created what Cayce called a vortex of negative spiritual energy that influenced anyone who lived in the house. They fed off the fear and suffering they generated, growing stronger with each tragedy they orchestrated. The souls had become so skilled at manipulation that they could predict exactly which emotional triggers would cause living individuals to act destructively, creating self-fulfilling prophecies of doom that validated their twisted worldview. But wait, there's something even more disturbing that Cayce discovered about how to identify if you or your family might be under the influence of earthbound souls. In reading 5754-12, he provided specific warning signs that indicate spiritual interference from trapped entities. These include sudden personality changes that mirror deceased family members, unexplained knowledge about historical events or people you've never studied, compulsive behaviors that seem foreign to your natural character, and recurring dreams featuring the same deceased individuals trying to communicate urgent messages. Perhaps most frightening is what Cayce revealed about how these influences can be passed down through bloodlines. Earthbound souls often attach to pregnant women, influencing the developing consciousness of unborn children. These babies are born already carrying the spiritual imprint of trapped entities, manifesting behavioral problems, unexplained fears, or psychological disorders that seem to have no environmental cause. The result is spiritual bondage that begins before birth and can persist throughout entire lifetimes unless properly addressed. Cayce's most urgent warning concerned what he called the multiplication effect of earthbound souls. In reading 2072-15, he explained that souls who successfully resist moving on after death often inspire others to make the same devastating choice. They actively discourage newly deceased spirits from accepting guidance toward higher dimensions, convincing them that earthly attachment is preferable to the unknown spiritual journey ahead. This creates exponential growth in the population of trapped souls, with each earthbound entity potentially influencing dozens of others to remain anchored to the physical world. Cayce predicted that without intervention, entire regions could become spiritually compromised by networks of earthbound consciousness, creating areas where spiritual evolution becomes virtually impossible for the living. The implications of Cayce's warnings extend far beyond individual cases of spiritual interference. He revealed that the growing population of earthbound souls represents one of the greatest threats to human spiritual development, creating barriers to consciousness evolution that affect entire societies. These trapped entities actively oppose spiritual progress, preferring to maintain systems of fear, materialism, and emotional dysfunction that keep both the living and the dead trapped in cycles of suffering. As we reach the conclusion of this disturbing journey into Edgar Cayce's darkest revelations, remember that knowledge of these spiritual dangers also provides the power to protect yourself and your loved ones. Cayce consistently taught that earthbound souls can only influence individuals who remain spiritually unaware and emotionally unguarded. Through daily spiritual practice, meditation, prayer, and conscious development of your higher consciousness, you create protective barriers that these trapped entities can't penetrate. The choice facing every soul at death is the same choice we face every day in life. Do we cling to fear, attachment, and material concerns? Or do we trust in the spiritual journey toward higher consciousness and divine love? Those who choose attachment create their own prisons. Those who choose growth find freedom. The terrifying reality of earthbound souls serves as a warning about the consequences of spiritual stagnation. But it also illuminates the incredible importance of conscious spiritual development. While we still have the opportunity, to choose our path. Your spiritual evolution begins now in this lifetime with every choice you make toward love over fear, growth over stagnation, and service over selfishness. Don't wait until death to discover whether you're prepared for the ultimate transition. Begin preparing today, because according to Edgar Cayce's documented revelations, the choices you make now will determine whether you find freedom or imprisonment when your time comes to leave this physical world behind.